Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to BKL's latest property webinar, this time with a focus on the PBSA market. Just a little introduction to us, although I'm sure most of you know who we are already. We're a 23 partner practice, one location in Finchley Central, with significant ambition to grow following taking investment in April this year. Property is our single largest specialism, making up nearly 25% of our overall business. And we've got some very, very experienced property partners, all ably supported by our exceptional tax team. We're able to call on the talents of people like Andrew Levine to cover direct tax issues, and Simon Levine, who you hear from later, on all matters VAT. And we're very fortunate that we have some very commercial and forward-thinking clients. This has enabled us to be involved in the PBSA sector and the challenges it brings for the last 10 years. And we've seen the sector mature over this time. So is PBSA in a good place? There's still an increasing demand for purpose-built student accommodation. There's a rising number of international students, relatively anti-cyclical, theoretically recession-proof. There's plenty of competition from lenders, therefore providing various options on structure. There's an active market for exit on completion of the developments. It is more sophisticated than on the completion of traditional resi development. It's a rational market. Access to information is more readily available than for other property sectors. Potential investor can find a great deal of information relating to existing developments from local authorities, or simply walking around an existing building, which isn't necessarily the case for lots of residential developments. However, these projects are large projects where planning can take a number of years, so experience or access to experience is vital to even get off the ground. More than any other asset class, missing a deadline can be a disaster for PBSA. If the building is not ready for the start of the academic year, this can have a serious impact on profitability. The industry isn't immune to other issues and challenges. As you're all no doubt aware, the recent market challenges have impacted all areas of the property sector. Rising interest rates have made funding more of a challenge, both on the build cost and those looking to purchase when complete. That said, funders still see PBSA as a stable, inflation-linked asset, and although it may be more costly, borrowing is still accessible. Worldwide issues have clearly added to the cost of all developments, as well as access to labour, and these PBSA structures are large, so these issues can be exacerbated. Environmental issues are also becoming a key focus in the industry, which are already adding to costs of building projects. There's going to be increasing pressure on the industry to comply with these sustainability goals, and putting your head in the sand and hoping it will be someone else's issue is not enough going forward. So how can we help? As you know, the key to any building project is planning, and involving advisors at early stages is vital. We come across and deal with all sorts of issues: structuring for investment or sale, tax efficient profit extraction, ensuring the flexibility of structuring as much as possible to keep options open is always a challenge. Considering joint venture agreements and whatever they mean for the individual projects involved and the tax implications on them. VAT planning, OPCOs, PropCos, the tension between VAT, SDLT, MDR issues, as well as capital allowances and corporate interest restrictions for the larger projects. These are all areas that we have and can readily advise and help on. To provide an insight into how we can advise, we have Simon Levine, our font of everything property VAT, to provide some thoughts into issues that you may come across, and we will come to this a little later. Hang on. Lost my place, sorry. Before we get onto the detail of VAT, Mafanwi is going to talk to us about ESG, the general issues this presents, and a focus on the PBSA market for you to really start thinking about how these issues will impact on the current and future projects. There are financial implications to ESG measures. These are not just matters for activists to be concerned with. These issues will impact on all of us, and business understands that. Investors, insurers, bankers see ESG as a vital KPI of their investments. And so we really need to understand what that means for those developing out PBSA. So to take a look at this in more detail, Mav?
Awesome. Hello. I'm just going to flick through the slides. Can you guys see the slides flicking forwards?
There you go. I was so engrossed in what I was saying, I forgot to move forward.
Bless you. Cool. All right. So here we are. ESG. Why do people give a stuff? So I thought it was useful to start with this slide to kind of think, so ESG is a big buzzword. Why does it really matter? Who cares about it? And the people that really care about it at the moment are the big ticket investors. And that's because what they want to make sure of is that any investments that they want to ensure or invest in the future are viable assets, effectively, because they've recognised that the world we're living in today isn't going to be the same as the world we're going to be living in tomorrow. And what they want to understand is, are we as business leaders and asset owners aware of these issues, and are we planning for them properly? So I thought it might be useful to start with some graphs and data. I love data. So here are some information from the BBC website, for example, on the fact that climate is changing. And I think the bit that's really useful here to look at is the section of the bottom graph here that talks about more hot weather and more extreme hot weather. And this isn't just around the heat, it's around rain, it's about withstanding stronger winds. And what our buildings need to be able to do is to cope with this stuff. I mean, we've all heard on the news about the rail infrastructures can't cope with the heat. Well, we've got to think about our buildings in that context too, so that becomes more and more important. This is a graph, this is a data set from the Institute of Chartered Accountants looking at the global GDP impacts of different temperatures on and the context of the temperatures here is 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and that's what all the net zero pledges that are out there at the moment are trying to do, trying to keep us to 1.5 degrees so that we minimize the global GDP impact of any climate change implications on us as a country, but a country globally, actually, not just as a country. And what we're aiming for at the moment is to try and keep it below 1.5 degrees. What we can see is that to achieve this, we need global emissions to fall by 42% by 2030. So that's like 8 years to almost halve global emissions. It's not that likely. So what we're aiming for and what we've got a plan for is more around the 3 degree scenarios. And as business owners and property developers, that's the sort of thing we need to be planning for. So either looking at the implications on our buildings of that, or implications of significant and more regulation coming in over the years to come. So if we're looking at crystal ball gazing, this is the kind of stuff we need to be thinking about. And why it matters for the property sector, well, we're responsible for 25% of global emissions. And you can see here the graph on the right. Like I said, I love data, and this is what the UK government has been doing behind the scenes, although they haven't been publicising it that noisily, in terms of reducing the grid reliance on non-renewable sources. So you can see where we've ended up at 2020 is that we've now got transport decreasing significantly, energy decreasing significantly. So where we've got to now focus efforts is on business and residential. And that's where all of our real estate assets hang out effectively. So a lot more regulation, a lot more implication and changes coming down the line. What is a sustainable building? I thought it might be useful to spend a bit of time thinking about this. I've split it between these 3 pillars: environmental, social, economic. What is clear is that, and I think this is an opportunity as well as a risk for the PBSA sector, is that our sector is much further behind other real estate sectors in terms of looking at sustainable buildings and planning sustainable buildings. And what's quite cool here is that the opportunity is obvious. If we can create more sustainable buildings, and that's interesting and unusual and innovative in the sector, but we can also look at the techniques that have been used by the other developers to create sustainable buildings in the other sectors too. So that's pretty cool. So we're looking at buildings that consider the full life cycle of a building. At the moment, the valuation premise that we all work on is based on what is the rental yield today, and how does that implicate the value of our building today? But it doesn't take into consideration future regulation and future implications. So what we need to start thinking about is looking at slightly differently at valuation. So understanding that we're in a bit of a transition at the moment. And we've got to operate in today's valuation terms, but also with a view on future valuation implications too. So here we're looking at operating costs of a building. I mean, the maintenance cost of a building over its lifetime is 3 times the build cost, but we don't build in operating costs very often into the build plan. So we need to start thinking slightly differently about that. We need to start thinking slightly differently about decommissioning costs too. What happens at the end of the life of a building? At the moment, it doesn't cost that much in real terms to knock a building down, but the carbon implications of knocking a building down are huge. That's the embodied carbon term. I don't know if you've heard of it, but that's the idea, is that the carbon it takes to build a building and what's encased in its brickwork, for example, is pretty significant. It can be about 60% of the in-use carbon emissions from a property. These are the sorts of things we're going to have to start thinking about, like more innovative build materials, thinking more circular rather than linear in terms of the waste coming up at the process. And that's all the environmental side of things. I've also mentioned here biodiversity. Biodiversity net gain is a big deal at the moment in and across the sector. And so they're really important factors to bear in mind. The social factors, I mean, everybody wants a healthy, happy building to live in and to operate in. So this idea of sense of community, access to amenities, nature, a happy space with good air quality, flowing around freely, that sort of stuff, that's not news to anyone, I'm sure. But also in the economic pillar, like I said, we're operating in a time at the moment where we've got one foot in one camp, and we can see another camp emerging in terms of valuation of properties and what things cost. So I think the really forward-looking developer investor will have an eye on what's the value of stuff today, but also what does it mean for the future. So thinking about the lifetime value of a building, thinking about how to start funding retrofits. I think I've said on the slide somewhere that so the retrofit aspect is so much more expensive to build into the fabric of a building than it would be if we thought about these things from the beginning. So if we start thinking about the builds and their life cycles with that future looking hat on, then we can save ourselves a lot more money in the future. Also, what's quite cool is that there is a bit of a premium at the moment, that they call it the green premium for sustainable products, whereas in the future, that green premium is likely to become a way of living and a way of life and a way of valuing. And the term that's being bandied around now is the idea of this brown discount in the future, which is a horrible way of putting it. But yeah, the brown discount is not the way we want to be. I've got some examples here of some pretty cool current developments in the PBSA sector. This one here is Unite Students' development. It was completed in September 23. It's a big part of their forward look at their net zero plan. So they're looking forward to net zero in they're looking forward to a net zero position for their organisation by 2030. And this building is a key part of that process of moving towards that. So yeah, the build itself has been fully thought through from a super efficient perspective, off-grid reliance as much as possible, outdoor, biodiverse spaces, large study, social spaces, all the good things that we'd want to be seeing. And I mean, as they proudly say on their website, it was delivered on time and on budget. So well done, Unite Students. But it's nice to see these sorts of things coming up in the sector. This isn't accommodation, but I wanted to include it because it shows the ways that universities are looking at sustainable buildings too. Now, the Enterprise Centre by the University of East Anglia is one of the world's most sustainable buildings. How cool is that? I've also included the heat map, because I'm a bit of a geek about this stuff. So you can see how the building is keeping all of its heat in from an internal and an external perspective, and that's what makes it Passive House. I don't know if you guys have come across Passive House, but it's basically a measure, an official measure of a building's efficiency, and that it is super 100% airtight and energy efficient, whilst also thinking about moisture content, etc., etc. So again, here, what the University of East Anglia did was use a brownfield site and develop it using local materials, low carbon materials, and really think about sustainability running through every aspect of the building. They've also got insect hotels as well, apparently, which sounds pretty cool to me. Yeah, so that's that building there. Horizon scanning. So I've touched on some of these things before, and I think what's tricky at the moment is that we're really, like I've said a couple of times, we're really in this transitional phase of one foot in today's camp and also being able to crystal ball gaze effectively into tomorrow. So what I've tried to do is split these up between immediate, near term and long term, so we can start to build a picture of the sorts of things we're thinking about here. So in the immediate term, we've got naturally the consumer preference, health and energy efficiencies. Are we building spaces that people actually want to live in? So they're the sorts of things people are talking about quite a lot at the moment. And we're also at the same time seeing quite a lot of growing regulation, but it's not much of it has teeth at the moment, for want of a better phrase. And so we can see the EPC regulations, for example. We're not sure what the government's going to do. Are they really going to roll this out? Are they not? Rishi Sunak seems to be saying one thing in the press one day and then something else happens. It's not entirely clear whether the government are, I don't know if I'm being too political now, actually, but it's not clear whether there is teeth in any of the regulation or the announcements that are coming out at the moment. But we have got the biodiversity net gain regulation, which has come in relatively recently for January 24 onwards. We've also got the drama around nutrient neutral as well that's come around, that nobody's quite sure what's really going to happen there. And I think what's helpful to note is that while regulation is increasing, that there isn't currently any regulation around carbon right now. So again, this is an opportunity as much as anything else. The embodied carbon implications for buildings, as I suggested before, is that if we do stuff now that we can't do in future to help us out for the future, that could be a really helpful thing. And what I'm trying to get at here is that in the future, it might not be possible to just demolish a building. The concept of stranded assets then starts to come into the picture, which is the idea that in the future, a building might have too much carbon regulation on it to knock it down. It might not be possible to retrofit it within a sensible cost estimation. So nobody will want to pay for the retrofits. You can't insure it if it's hasn't got a net zero plan. You can't finance it without a net zero plan. And nobody wants to occupy it because social norms have changed, and also occupiers also want to worry about their carbon impact too. So that's what we call then a stranded asset, an asset that nobody can do anything with. So I suppose the opportunity now for clued up investors and developers is to really understand what have you got in your portfolios right now, and do you have a net zero plan for those assets? For the ones that are in construction, are you able to look at what you've got in development and see, is there anything that you can do to upgrade those in sustainability terms? Is there anything in your portfolio that's not possible to be retrofitted or anything done with them in a cost-effective way? And what's your plan for those? Because what we're seeing in the market at the moment is a lot of the institutional investors, a lot of the investors that already have to have net zero plans in place, divesting of those assets, but not saying why. I mean, you wouldn't, would you? Because the market today is still selling those properties at current day valuation prices. So there is an opportunity, I suppose, a bit of an irresponsible thing to do maybe is to dump all those assets in the market right now, or to come up with an appropriate plan to bring those assets up to date and to think about what's to come in the future. So that's immediate term stuff. Near term, what we can see starting to happen in the market already is preferential lending for more efficient buildings or businesses with net zero plans. It's a growing market at the moment, but there's definitely opportunities out there for funding where you've got green plans in place. We've also got to think about resource efficiency. I was really surprised the other day, actually, to realise that London is number 9 in the world list of cities that will likely run out of water in 10 years' time. And that's because we don't use it efficiently at the moment. So we use drinking water to flush toilets, for example. So there are things like grey water systems that can help capture water and then use it well, use it effectively. And it's not a leap then to think, well, if water becomes really scarce, well, it is scarce already, I suppose, then that will become more expensive. We'll have to spend more to retrofit our buildings to be able to match water legislation. So there's lots of things here that's useful to start thinking about if we're looking at crystal ball gazing for the future. And that ties into this idea of construction projects. At the minute, we have a very linear process. We take, make, waste. And if we can start thinking in a more circular way, that'd be really beneficial for us. The carbon border, the cross-border carbon adjustment mechanism is coming into the EU already, where they are focusing on things like cement and building materials as their first port of call to start looking at this. But again, if there are different tariffs for different materials that are central to the construction sector, that's going to start driving up our cost of build. So we're going to have to start thinking about different materials anyway. And also, not to mention, I put in near term, but it really should have been between immediate and near, around value chain reporting. So we're seeing public sector contracts, contracts that are servicing large PLCs, for example, having to offer a lot more in terms of sustainability reporting on the works that they do and then the projects that they're running. So that's already in and around the sector, and will only increase as regulation grows. And then in terms of longer term stuff, I mentioned this already, we're going to have to build buildings that withstand different types of climate than we're used to. Insurance, lending principles. My crystal ball prediction is that these are all going to have to change. I know the insurers are already worried about what the implications are for them in climate change world, because they can't insure buildings that aren't built to withstand what is going to become a normal weather system for us. The net zero economy is going to change. The norms are going to change around waste in the sector, and a lot more regulation in place restricting what we're going to do. So again, these are some of the immediate, near-term, longer-term implications that are really useful to build into your planning. Start thinking about from where you are at the moment. Actually, it feels like a big thing, but it's just a case of starting from where you are right now, I think, and being realistic about where we are right now. So in terms of recommendations, I think number 1, top priority on the list is look at your existing portfolio, look at what you're building, look at what you've got, and just really think about what the potential is there for lost future value, and get some really good advice on what to do with that. So there's some brilliant advisors out there on retrofits. We've got one attending or running a webinar with us in a couple of weeks' time from PDP Studio. And retrofits are one of those things that are really difficult to execute well and execute without adverse implications, for want of a better term. So have a good think about what you can do. Start thinking differently about new developments. Don't go for the basic standards, I think, is another thing to really consider in all of this, because what we can see is an increase in regulation. And if you can build stuff in cost effectively now, then do it. Look for alternative sources of electricity, whether it's a clean source, whether it's on-site generation. There's a lot of value to be gathered there. PV panels cost a fraction of what they used to cost in the old days. I say old days. And also speak to your lenders about alternative funding options. I think they're the key things that I'd go with as a starting point. There we go. That's me done, Jason.
Thanks, Mav. Just to pick up on 2 things, I think you're talking about stranded assets. I think that's very relevant now in the commercial property market, and it's becoming more relevant everywhere else. You also mentioned the biodiversity net gain bill, which I believe comes in January 24. Is there anything that you can add on that?
Yes. So the idea with the biodiversity net gain regulation is to is to look after the natural species and natural habitats that exist in the UK. So in order to get planning through from January 24 onwards, and I think there's like a stagger thing for SME developments, is that we're going to have to start thinking about how we prove and demonstrate that our development will generate at least a 10% gain in biodiversity. You can do it by buying credits, a bit, like the carbon credits that you have in the market at the moment, where you just pay away your problem. But what the Environment Agency wants to do is to peg those prices as very high, so that it becomes literally like a last resort option. So the idea is that we start to think about our development at planning stage, so that they are improving the biodiversity of the location and the habitat before and after. So yes, and interesting also is that there are slightly different rules for England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So depending on where you're building, have a look at what the specific requirements are in each of those locations. And yeah, it's like I said, it's one of those things that is really indicative of more and more regulation coming into the sector.
Thank you so much. Now,
you're so welcome.
That's all right. Right now, trying to think about how the best way to segue from one to the other, but something that is very new to the market to something that has been around for a very long time, but we still need to make sure we're considering it at an early stage. There we go. There I am. As we mentioned, we have an exceptional tax team. This is exemplified by our VAT team. Simon has been there and done it. It amazes me the number of property businesses outside of BKL that Simon has advised. We even had a group of people chanting his name at 2 a.m. outside the Martinez at MIPIM in celebration of the advice that he has provided them over the years, to everybody's much great amusement. The VAT man is commercial, practical, always thorough, detail. Simon's mantra is to let me see the planning permission. We have been involved in many schemes where VAT planning has not been fully thought through. We see issues where the project that was intended to be sold and can't be sold due to market conditions. This kind of planning hasn't been considered at the start, so trying to unwind the position we find ourselves in. Scenarios where planning permission does not match the intended VAT planning, and we've seen so many incidents of unnecessary VAT leakage simply because there was not enough upfront thought. So with no further ado, the VAT man.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. HMRC very helpfully have said in the past that when the government devised the law on new residential accommodation, they didn't want VAT to be a sticking cost. Now, obviously, there still is some costs which are subject to VAT, but as Jason said, I see so many projects where VAT is never thought of at an early enough stage, and in fact, sometimes at a very, very late stage, to the extent that it can't be undone, and we're firefighting. But I just wanted over the next 10-15 minutes just to go through the main issues that I come across and just sort of points to put out there. In relation to minimizing VAT leakage, as I said, when you're building a new build residential student accommodation project, there shouldn't really be much VAT incurred. That will be a cost. It's generally towards the end of the fit out stage, which will be things like carpets, curtains, white goods in the kitchen, furniture, and parts of an audiovisual system. And certainly in big new student accommodation blocks now, you've got various communal facilities, breakout areas, a cinema, things like that. We have to be very careful. Also, dwellings versus relevant residential. Now, historically, HMRC saw student accommodation as relevant residential, which was quite restrictive, and there was a lot of boxes you needed to tick. And then in about 2014, they changed the rules and helpfully said, well, actually, under certain conditions, we will actually see student accommodation as being dwellings. And I'll go into a little bit more about why that is more helpful. And the key to a lot of this, especially with the dwellings versus relevant residential, is planning permission. As Jason said, I harp on about it, and it is something that, you know, needs to be considered at a very early stage. Sometimes I've actually been asked to review something and the clients thought it was a very quick sign off, and lo and behold, from a VAT point of view, there's some major problems which ranged, in the best case scenario, from a quick NMA, non-material amendment, being applied to, in some cases a very big Section 73 amendment having been applied for. And as you'll all be aware, if you have to stick in a Section 73, you could be looking at months before it is, if it does get approved. So when we're talking about construction of a new build that's zero rated, there are three main types of developments that can be zero rated. One is the construction of a dwelling or a number of dwellings. One is the construction of a new build relevant residential building, student accommodation, and the other one is a relevant charitable building. Now, what are examples of new build residential dwellings? Self-contained house or flats, or the live part of live work units. And very importantly for new build, it must be completely new, either on bare land, underneath, side, or on top of an existing block or building, but cannot utilize any of an existing building. Now, there is a complication about when there's an existing building on site which you want to redevelop, and the level of demolition. Now, I haven't gone into it today in detail because I don't have the time. But what I would say is if you have an existing building on the site, it either has to be completely and utterly demolished to ground level or below, or in some cases, HMRC will allow what we call a facade retention scheme, which mainly means you're only allowed to retain the front facade only. If it's a corner plot, you get the corner double facade, but nothing else. I've had a case with a PBSA scheme where the former building was demolished, or the plan permission said it was being demolished to everything apart from the front facade. But what the contractor and the client decided to do was to keep part of the flanking walls on each side to hold up the front facade, rather than pay for a very expensive frame. The problem was, because they were keeping more than the front facade, it blew the zero rating. Now, thankfully, I was brought in during the demolition stage and spotted this very quickly, and we managed to get an amendment in. But that alone, I mean, you were talking about 1.5 meters of two side flanking walls could have ruined zero rating on a multi-million-pound project. So the planning permission and what you're actually going to do, especially with demolition, is absolutely key and needs to be considered at the earliest stage possible. Now, newly constructed student accommodation can take more than one form. The first one is the type of accommodation which might be characterized as communal living with shared facilities in a large building, which is colloquially and historically what we call a halls of residence, or where the accommodation may have been designed as a dwelling, such as a flat, cluster, flat, or studio, so effectively a block of flats. The one thing to point out is that just because there might be a usage restriction being student accommodation, that's not going to affect anything, as you'll see in a moment. So what is a cluster flat? The term cluster flat refers to a type of arrangement where a collection of study bedrooms are arranged around a communal kitchen or dining area. Toilet and washing facilities may be communal or en suite. The reason why this is still considered a flat is, even though you might have 3, 4, 5, or even bigger bedroom cluster flat, they're all behind a single door. So effectively, whilst you have different students living there, they're all in a single flat. And then what is a studio flat? A studio flat is one which has study bedrooms but possesses its own kitchen and dining space together with toilet and washing facilities. HMRC now accept that buildings containing these flats may satisfy the conditions for either zero rating as being both intended for use solely for relevant residential purposes or designed as a dwelling or number of dwellings. Where this occurs, a developer may rely on either provision to secure the zero rated relief. However, one word of warning, if you go for relevant residential, there's a lot more restrictions, which I'll talk about one of them, which is regarding certification, but also during non-term time, so the very long summer, if you have got a relevant residential, there are restrictions on how long and how you actually are able to rent out the flats for other use, for example, for summer school. That's why certainly at BKL, we advise all of our clients when they're going for planning, they need to try and make sure that the PBSA is going to be considered a number of dwellings, effectively a block of flats. Now, what is a dwelling? Very important. There's 4 conditions, which all conditions must actually be met. You miss one of these conditions and it's not a dwelling. So the first one is that it's self-contained accommodation. So effectively it has somewhere to sleep, a toilet, a bath, kitchenette, no internal access between the flats. So obviously if you're going to go from one flat to the other, as long as you have to go out into the communal hallway, that's absolutely fine. What the law is trying to get out here is if you have a situation like a hotel room, which is interconnecting internal doors, that's what they want to avoid. I have to say that at least for the last 10 years, I've never seen any issue with internal access like that. As I said, if you want to go even from one cluster flat to another, you generally have to go out into the communal hallway, and that's absolutely fine. Built in accordance with the granted statutory planning permission. This one might seem obvious, but sometimes I've come across situations where people have made various changes, but they were a little bit slow on applying for the amendments to the local council. One case, an amendment got completely missed off and had to be retrospectively applied for, but it had an impact and knock-on effect of VAT. And then the last one, which is the big problem with this area of when student accommodation can be considered dwellings, is no restriction on the separate use and disposal. Now, as I said, if it's a usage restriction, like it can only be used for students from a particular city, then that's fine. That's not what this means. What this is referring to is if the planning permission says, for example, let's say you're building a block of 50 flats, and they say that the flats can only be used or disposed of together, then you've got a problem. So the separate use and disposal restriction that causes a VAT impact is in relation to when the properties are linked in some way. Now, as I said, if you have a situation where you're building a 50 flat block of flats, but the restriction is that they can only be, let's say, disposed of together, then you're not going to be a dwelling, but you can still consider what we call the relevant residential route. But as I said, at BKL, certainly one of the very early discussions we have with all of our clients is to try and get the planning permission in as dwellings. And in fact, I can't recall, certainly the last 5 years, any developments we've had where we weren't able to get dwellings. Now, obviously, when you are building let's say a dwelling or relevant residential, there are certain goods that you're going to ordinarily incorporate. So what sort of materials can you ordinarily incorporate that can actually have the 0 rating as well? So this is where the contractor will buy these items and along with the labor will install them. And just for example, I've got there, you got your burglar alarms, fire alarms, fixed light fittings, PowerPoint, smoke detectors, TV aerials, and the wiring. But obviously cabling is only where it's embedded in the walls. Now, obviously, this is only a very short list. There's a very long list on HMRC's notice in 708, but that's just an example. Now, when is construction complete? Now, why is this important? Because effectively, if you're building a new build, the 0 rating will apply up to the point of completion. After completion, any work, because it's no longer in the course of construction, will not be 0 rated. So if you are thinking of building a block of student accommodation and doing other works, for example, I had one client who what they wanted to do is they had a load of balconies, but then what they thought they would do later on is enclose some of them in a way like a bit of a conservatory. That could have caused them a problem if that work had been done after the building is complete. So it's very important, if you're looking for zero rating, is that all the work should be done while the building is in construction, i.e. before it's complete. So when is construction complete? Completion takes place at a given moment in time. That point in time is determined by weighing up the relevant factors of the project, such as when a certificate of completion is issued, it should be in accordance with the approved plans and specifications, the scope of the planning consent and variations to it, and whether the building is habitable or fit for purpose. Once construction is complete, as I said, any further supplies to construction other than snagging are no longer in the course of construction and thus ineligible for zero rating. Now, VAT certificates, they're only for relevant residential or relevant charitable. So if you've got a development that is considered relevant residential because it doesn't meet the conditions of a dwelling, in order to get the zero rating because you were going to rent it out as student accommodation, you have to issue the builder a special VAT certificate. It's a self-completed one. You really need to be doing it before the work start. HMRC will allow a late certificate, but the certificate, if needed and you don't give it, is going to blow the zero rating. Now, with the certificate, you are certifying that you, as in the person issuing it, is going to be using it as student accommodation. And there's a bit of a debate. If, for example, you're going to develop, but you're going to sell it on or lease it to somebody else, if you have a relevant residential situation, you can't issue the certificate, because if you're going to rent it to someone else or sell it to someone else and they will use it, then might not be able to issue a certificate. We can always work something around that. You pay the VAT and you get it back because maybe the sale or the lease to a user will be more than 21 years in a day, but certificate is very important to consider. And then something that if I got a penny for every time people ask me about this, I'd be a rich man. People, they want, if they're building a dwelling, they want a certificate. Certificates or the VAT certificates are not needed for a dwelling. A lot of contractors still don't understand this, and I literally have had 2 requests this week from clients of mine that the builders want a certificate, and as I said, there isn't one. Now, whilst the main PBSA schemes we deal with are brand new build residential, there is also situations we've had where clients are buying brownfield sites, and rather than going for demo and rebuild, they're going for a conversion. And when you're going for conversion, you cannot get the zero rated on the conversion costs. There is actually a reduced 5% rate of VAT, which it's been in since 2001, but there's actually still a lot of people who don't know it exists. So there's 2 main developments where you can get the builder to charge you the 5% VAT rate. Number one is, I'll go for the second one first, which is where you're changing the number of dwellings. So, for example, if you have got one I've dealt with recently, a very big former office building is being converted into 100 student flats, or about 100 student flats, because you're changing from 0 to 100, then that qualifies for the 5% VAT rate. Now, one other development we had was an old halls of residence, which was a bit derelict by university, and the client is basically buying it over to massively refurbish it again to keep a student accommodation. So as long as we can prove, which we can, that nobody has lived in that halls of residence for at least 2 years before the work starts, the strip out and refurb effectively to be rented out on a HMO type setup to students, the work can be at the 5% VAT rate. But obviously with the 2 years empty, there has to be very clear third-party written evidence. So if you have a situation that this is relevant to, please come and speak to me and I'll talk you through the areas. So again, with regard to that, just saying again that at least 2 years prior to the work starting on site is the 2 years empty. It's not any 2 years, it's the immediate 2 years or longer. Unfortunately, as we know, there have been situations in the past where people, to deter squatters, they hire guardians. There's a lot of guardians companies who come in to protect the premises. HMRC have now said that if your property is occupied by guardians, because we know it's there to protect the property, they will ignore that usage. Obviously, when I've had that, what I've generally got is I've asked the client to get a copy of the guardian agreement so we can show HMRC, and also sometimes ask the guardian companies to provide a letter of confirmation, which to date they've all been very happy to do so. It needs to be third-party reliable evidence that it's been empty. HMRC are not going to accept anyone's word. As the famous phrase goes, verbal confirmations are not worth the paper they're written on, so we'll need to have that. The best evidence that HMRC asks for are council tax bills with either the empty house discount, or what we actually have now is the 2-year empty premium. There's a premium on council tax the HMRC issue. As I say, the council's issue once a residential accommodation has been empty for more than 2 years, or you get a letter from the council's empty housing officer confirming the premises has been empty. If you can't have those, then we need to have things like confirmation of electoral roll, utility bills, and other evidence, but it's get as much evidence as possible. And that's it. As I said, this whole area, it's I could talk for quite a few hours on it. There's a lot of issues. I've just tried to keep these to the main areas, but obviously happy afterwards if people want to ask a few questions, I can answer. There we go, Jason.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, immediate questions, you can pop them in the chat now, or if you come up with a question that you'd like to ask one of the experts, then forward it on to us and we'll get back to you as soon as we can with a response. I think you'll see that the expertise we have at hand, the issues that we've got coming in the next few years, and the insight we can give on VAT. I'd like to talk to you as well about a webinar that we've got next Wednesday on the challenges in the property sector, where, as Mother's already mentioned, one of the areas we're covering, we are covering issues regarding the Building Safety Act of 2022, which is creating lots and lots of questions for clients. We have someone coming in to talk to us about rate savings, I believe, and someone coming in to talk to us about retrofit. And I think that should be an interesting webinar of people and contacts that BKL are in contact with. You do have a question.
Okay, so Jason's question just come through. Is an extension to an existing PBSA development zero rated or reduced rated with it being increased in numbers? A lot depends. If the existing PBSA development or existing building is what we call designed as dwellings, and effectively, let's say you get planning permission for some additional floors, as long as those additional floors are for, let's say on the top, let's say it's a flat roof and you're building on top, as long as those floors are for additional dwellings, then yes, that can be zero rated, because effectively the new build flats are in effectively airspace. However, if it's effectively relevant residential and you're just extending that relevant residential building, no, it won't be zero rated. So that's an example of how clear and important it is to try and get the development classed as much as you can as dwellings rather than relevant residential. And just one more thing, if, for example, you are building on the roof and it's what I call a butterfly roof, or it's what I call the inverted V shape that you see on houses, so it's not flat, then any flats that are utilizing that roof void are going to be 5% VAT, not zero. So the key is hopefully have a flat roof. Okay.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Stephen. Question from Matthew: is a set of criteria to determine whether a building is habitable or fit for purpose, Simon?
Okay, I'm going to assume that that goes in with relation to VAT rather than one more. I mean, obviously, habitable. I mean, the HMRC. There has been a few cases where HMRC have basically said a building is complete, but they've gone to court where it's not habitable. It's one of those things. There's nothing set in stone, but generally, what HMRC look at when we talk about completion is the building regs sign off. So generally, with building regs sign off, if basically the inspector has said that the building has been built in accordance with the plans and effectively is fit for purpose, because obviously, if you didn't have building regs sign off, there would be an issue. The other criteria that or indicator, I should say, the HMRC look for is when you start your council tax. So if, for example, you have a building and you start getting your council tax listed and for refuse removal and everything, that is also an indicator. So there's no, as it were, hard and fast rule, but there are indicators around. Can you say more about the ways? Co-living is co-living is something that's very, very new. I've only dealt with one co-living, and the interesting thing co-living is the planning permission is very, very important, because with the co-living is for example, the workspace, who's it open to? Because obviously, if you've got a co-living workspace situation and it's open to everybody, well, you've got a bit of a problem, both what I call residents and non-residents, then you've got a bit of a problem. If it's open to just the residence itself, then again, depending on the planning, it could well be classed as effectively a block of flats or a building designed as a dwelling. But that is one of those things, because it's such a new concept, co-living, we really need to look at the planning in order to inform the developer what the VAT status is. Hopefully that's answered your question, Conrad. Okay, so what about if the demolition works are undertaken in advance of the PBSC contract works by the same client, will this fit the if the demolition works are undertaken in advance on a separate contract with PBSC contract works by the same client, would this fit with the residential? Well, Craig, are you asking whether or not if you do the demolition works in advance, is that qualified for the zero rating if the PBSA scheme qualifies for zero rating? Okay. Yeah, I mean, HMRC say in their public notice 708, they do talk about, there is a section which talks about works done in advance of the rebuild, which effectively is preparing the site. So as long as the planning permission, is granted for demolition and rebuild when you do the demolition, then effectively it's part of the new build process. So HMRC will say demolition, which then leads straight on to the rebuild, can be zero rated. Now, I've actually had a situation recently where a client was arguing with the contractor because the contractor wanted to charge VAT. And when I looked at it, actually what had happened was the client was trying to jump the gun. He knew the planning permission was going to come through, but before it was actually granted, he basically decided to get the contractor on site so he could literally get going. The problem was, by doing the demolition before the planning for the demolition had been granted, he scuppered the zero rating. If he had just waited until the demo planning had been granted, then there wouldn't have been a problem. The other practical issue I sometimes see is if you have a separate demo contractor than the contractor actually doing the build. Because in theory, again, because you should normally go straight in from the demo stage into the build stage, then yes, it should be zero rated. But the times I've had this separate demo contractor, it's always been a big argument with them. And sometimes they didn't agree to it to zero rate. So my advice is if you're going to actually do a demo and rebuild, try and get either the same, well, basically the same contractor to do both. Okay.
Excellent. Thanks for those excellent questions. Thanks for your full and expert response, Simon, as always. Thanks for listening to us for the last hour. Muv's insights are becoming more and more relevant. Any questions you may have on this area or uncertainties, then we'd certainly be happy to follow up. And hopefully there's a couple of follow-ups on VAT with Simon. And we would all very much look forward to seeing you next week for our seminar next week. Thank you very much. See you soon.
Okay.